A child cries in front of his mother's tombstone, completely heartbroken, begging her to take him with her. Minutes later, a hand touched his shoulder, and a miracle happened. Mateo, a 7-year-old boy, lived a simple but love-filled life with his mother, Lisbeth. They were inseparable, like two halves of a whole. Lisbeth, at 28, was a resilient and hardworking woman, always willing to make sacrifices for her son's well-being. That night, as the sky turned gray and a storm broke over the city, Lisbeth picked Mateo up from his painting class, something she did every week with great joy. "Did you have fun, love?" Lisbeth asked with a smile through the rearview mirror as she drove. Mateo enthusiastically held up a drawing he had made for her. "Yes, Mom. I painted this for you. It's you and me at the park." Lisbeth chuckled softly. "It's beautiful, honey. We'll hang it on the living room wall so everyone can see it." Mateo smiled, enjoying the warm moment as the rain began to fall more heavily. On the opposite lane, a man in a dark sedan was driving distractedly, focused on his cell phone. A heated argument on the other end of the line had him agitated, and he paid little attention to the road. His gestures were quick, his eyes fixed on the screen. The storm further obscured his visibility. Suddenly, the sedan swerved into Lisbeth's lane. The impact was immediate. Lisbeth's car shook with a deafening crunch as Mateo screamed in fear. The man, in a desperate attempt to flee the scene, accelerated and struck the side of Lisbeth's car again, pushing it into the oncoming lane. A truck approached rapidly, and although the driver attempted to brake, there wasn't enough time. The crash was devastating. Inside the car, Lisbeth and Mateo were trapped among the wreckage. Lisbeth, her face covered in blood, opened her eyes with difficulty, feeling unbearable pain. Mateo, crying in the back seat, could barely move. "Mom," he called, his voice breaking. "Everything will be okay, love. Stay with me," Lisbeth whispered, summoning superhuman effort to stay calm. Emergency services arrived minutes later, racing against time to rescue the injured. They managed to pull Mateo out first, who sobbed uncontrollably as he repeatedly asked about his mother. "Is my mom okay? Is she okay?" he asked over and over, clinging to the paramedic's arm. "Calm down, little one. We'll tell you something soon, but for now, we need you to take a deep breath and stay still, okay?" The paramedic replied, trying to soothe him. Lisbeth was also rescued, but her condition was critical. As she was rushed to the hospital, tubes helping her breathe, she could barely speak. Yet only one thing filled her mind: her son. In the emergency room, surrounded by doctors and nurses, Lisbeth used her remaining strength to make a request. "Please, bring me my son," she begged weakly but firmly. The doctors hesitated, aware of the severity of her condition, but they complied. Mateo was brought into his mother's room. When she saw him, Lisbeth felt a small spark of strength. She reached out her hand to him, and Mateo ran to hold it. "Mom, you're bleeding. Don't worry, the doctors will fix you," the boy said, tears streaming down his face. Lisbeth smiled weakly. "My little one, my love, listen. I want you to remember something very important. No matter what happens, be an honest, kind, and caring person, just like you've always been with me." Mateo sobbed, holding her hand tightly. "But Mom, you'll always be with me, right? You're not going to leave me, are you?" Lisbeth took a deep breath, fighting the pain that gripped her body and heart. "I love you, Mateo. And wherever I am, I'll watch over you. I'll always protect you and take care of you. You'll be my pride." Mateo, his voice breaking, promised. "I promise, Mom. I'll be good. I'll be strong. I'll always visit you. I'll never forget you." Lisbeth looked at him with a mixture of sadness and pride. Her final words were barely a whisper, but they were filled with love. "You are my life, Mateo." Her hand went limp, and her gaze lost its light. Lisbeth had passed. Mateo screamed her name, trying to wake her, but there was no response. The doctors tried to comfort him, but the boy refused to let go of his mother's hand until he was finally pulled away. Hours later, Mateo sat in the hospital waiting room, staring into the void. He didn't fully understand the magnitude of what had happened, but he felt an immense emptiness in his chest. A social worker approached to explain that he needed to be taken to a safe place. "Mateo, sweetie, your mom loved you very much and always will, but now she's resting in a better place. Is there someone we can call?" "Any family?" the woman asked gently. Mateo shook his head, his eyes brimming with tears. "I don't want to go. I want to stay with her. I promised I'd always be with her." The social worker tried to console him, but Mateo couldn't hear anything beyond the echo of his mother's words. That night, as he slept in a strange bed at the temporary shelter, he clung to the drawing he had made that day. He whispered into the void, "I promise I'll be what you wanted, Mom. And I'll always visit you. Always." The promise was etched in his heart, and although he didn't know how he would face the future, he was determined to honor Lisbeth's memory. Mateo was transferred to an orphanage after his mother's death. The place, though clean and orderly, lacked warmth. The gray walls and silent hallways seemed to drain the hope from the children living there. Mateo, just 7 years old, carried an invisible weight that set him apart from the other kids. He didn't talk much, and when he did, it was to mention his mother or ask to go to the cemetery. On his first day, while the administrative staff filled out forms, a group of older boys watched him from a corner. They were the leaders of the orphanage, known for intimidating newcomers. One of them, named Jamie, approached Mateo with a fake smile. "So, you're the new kid?" Jamie asked, crossing his arms. Mateo didn't respond, clutching tightly the drawing he had made for his mother. Jamie smirked. "What's that? A little picture for your mommy? I bet she doesn't need it anymore, right?" Mateo, feeling a lump in his throat, only pressed the paper closer to his chest and took a step back. The other kids laughed, but Mateo didn't react. His silence was his refuge, though it also made him an easy target. When the social worker returned, she took his hand and led him to the room he would share with 3 other boys. There, Mateo put his drawing in the only drawer he had and sat on the bed, staring out the window. In the distance, he could see the cypress trees of the cemetery. He promised himself he would find a way to get there, even if he had to do it in secret. During the week, Mateo avoided the other kids as much as he could. His routine was simple: complete the orphanage's activities, eat in silence, and then look out the window until nightfall. However, his sadness didn't go unnoticed by one of the caregivers, Mrs. Angela, who tried to talk to him one afternoon. "Mateo, sweetheart, how are you feeling?" she asked, sitting next to him as he fiddled with a piece of string. Mateo looked up but didn't answer. Angela sighed and continued, "I know this is hard, but we're here to help you. You're not alone." Mateo stared at her, his eyes filled with a sadness too deep for a child. "I don't want to be here. I want to be with my mom." The response left Angela speechless. She knew there was no easy comfort for a pain like his, so she decided not to push him. She simply patted his hair and stood up, leaving him alone. That night, Mateo waited until everyone in the room was asleep. When he was sure no one was watching, he took his mother's drawing, carefully folded it, and slipped it into his pants pocket. Moving silently, he left the dorm and walked toward the orphanage's back door. He had memorized the way to the cemetery during the car ride with the social worker, and though the darkness scared him, his desire to be close to his mother was stronger. When he reached the cemetery, he found Lisbeth's grave and knelt in front of it. The cold night wind bit his face, but Mateo didn't move. He placed the drawing on the headstone and began speaking softly. "I miss you, Mom. I did what you asked, I stayed strong, but it's so hard. Can you hear me?" he asked, looking up at the sky. Tears began to roll down his cheeks as he continued. "I promised I would always visit you, and here I am. I won't forget you, I promise." At that moment, a gentle voice interrupted his monologue. "What are you doing here so late, little one?" Mateo turned quickly and saw a woman with dark hair and a kind face. It was Genesis, who was also visiting the cemetery that night to leave flowers on her son's grave. At first, Mateo said nothing, wary of the stranger. Noticing his fear, Genesis crouched down to his level. "You don't have to be scared. I'm here to visit someone I love very much too," she said, pointing to a nearby grave. Mateo, still silent, watched as she carefully placed the flowers and sat next to the headstone. After a moment, she added, "Sometimes talking to them helps. Do you want to tell me whose grave this is?" Mateo hesitated before answering. "It's my mom's. She told me she'd always watch over me." Genesis felt a pang in her chest. The pain in Mateo's voice reminded her of her own, but she didn't want to press him. She simply smiled gently. "I'm sure she does. You know, I think they always find a way to stay with us." Mateo didn't respond, but something in Genesis's voice made him feel less alone. They stayed there in silence for a while under the dim moonlight until Mateo stood up and prepared to return to the orphanage. Before he left, Genesis said, "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'll be here." Mateo gave her a slight nod and left, his mother's drawing back in his pocket. He didn't know it yet, but that night would mark the beginning of a profound change in his life. When Mateo returned to the orphanage, he was discovered by Jamie and his friends, who were waiting in the hallway. "And where were you, crybaby? Wanna see your mommy?" Jamie sneered at him. Mateo, tired and emotionally drained, didn't respond. But this time, he didn't let himself be intimidated. He clenched his teeth and walked to his room, ignoring the cruel laughter behind him. In his mind, his mother's words and the encounter with Genesis gave him strength. That night, for the first time, Mateo wasn't afraid to be alone. He had found a place where he could talk to his mother, and though the pain was still there, he knew he could face it. What he didn't know was that his connection with Genesis would change his life forever. Days later, Mateo was still trapped in the cold monotony of the orphanage. Every corner of the place seemed to remind him of what he had lost: the warmth of his home, the unconditional love of his mother, the life that had been abruptly taken from him. Nights were his only refuge. While the other children slept, he spoke to the only person he felt still understood him, his mother. Curled up in his bed, with his head under the blanket to muffle his sobs, Mateo whispered, hoping she could hear him. "Mom, I don't know what to do here. The kids are mean. They make fun of me because I have no one, because I lost you. I don't want to be here, Mom. Please, take me with you. I can't live without you." His tears soaked the pillow. This desperate plea repeated itself every night. He closed his eyes tightly, imagining the warm embrace of his mother wrapping around him once more. And then, in the dark silence of the room, he felt something. It wasn't a voice he could hear, but his heart sensed it. A soft whisper, an almost tangible presence. "I am always with you, my son, even if you can't see me," said the voice in his mind. It was like an echo of his mother's love, an invisible thread connecting him to her. Mateo clutched the drawing he had made for Lisbeth as if it could bring her back. The thought that his mother was still with him, somehow, gave him the strength to endure another day, even if it was filled with tears and ridicule. One night, Unable to bear the weight of his pain any longer, Mateo escaped to the cemetery once again. The damp ground and cold air didn't deter him. With determined steps, he reached his mother's grave, kneeling before the headstone. He cried, his voice trembling. "Mom, I can't take this anymore. There's no one good here. Everyone hates me. I feel so alone. Please, take me with you. I want to be where you are. I don't care about anything else. I just want to see you again." Mateo covered his face with his hands, feeling as if the entire world was crushing him. And then, a strange warmth surrounded him. It was as if the air itself had become thicker, warmer. A whisper seemed to emerge from nowhere. "My son, you are not alone. I am always with you." Mateo froze, looking around. No one was there. His heart raced, but it wasn't fear. It was as if, for a moment, he had truly felt his mother's presence. "Mom?" he asked in a trembling voice. No one replied, but something inside him calmed, as if Lisbeth had found a way to reach him. Mateo stayed there until the dawn forced him to return to the orphanage. During those days, Genesis couldn't stop thinking about the boy she had met at the cemetery. There was something haunting in his eyes, a mixture of pain and maturity that was unnatural for a child his age. One night, while sifting through a box of memories of her deceased son, she had a strange dream. In it, her son appeared, smiling and pointing to a path. Genesis woke up with her heart racing. Something inside her told her she needed to return to the cemetery. That same night, Mateo also decided to go to the cemetery. He had had an especially hard day. Jamie and the other kids had stolen his drawing of his mother and crumpled it in front of him. Mateo didn't cry in front of them, but inside, his world was crumbling even more. When he arrived at the grave, he found Genesis standing before the headstone. She turned when she heard him and recognized him immediately. "It's you," Genesis said, surprised but with a warm tone. Mateo looked at her distrustfully. He didn't understand why this woman was always near his mother's grave. "What are you doing here?" Mateo asked, wiping his tears with his sleeve. Genesis knelt down to his level. "I came to visit someone I love very much, just like you." The boy lowered his gaze, his heart still heavy with pain. Genesis continued, "Would you like to talk about her? Sometimes it helps to share how we feel." Mateo shook his head. He wasn't ready to open up to anyone else. However, Genesis didn't push. She took a small bouquet of flowers from her bag and placed it on Lisbeth's grave. "She loves you, you know that?" Genesis said, her voice full of tenderness. Mateo looked up, surprised. "How do you know that?" "Because I see it in your eyes. Only a great love can leave such a deep mark. And because I've also lost someone I love, and I know that love never goes away." Mateo didn't respond, but for the first time in weeks, he felt that someone truly understood him. Genesis looked at him seriously, as if she were considering something. "I promise we'll talk again," Genesis said before leaving. But what she didn't say was that she was determined to learn more about this boy who seemed so connected to her in ways she couldn't explain. That same night, Genesis had another unsettling dream. Her son appeared again, pointing to an unfamiliar building. When she woke up, she felt compelled to seek answers. The next day, she investigated and discovered that the building was an orphanage. Genesis decided she needed to visit it. What she found there left her stunned. Records of the boy she had met at the cemetery. Mateo. Reading his story, she felt that something bigger was happening, as if destiny was guiding her to him. Meanwhile, Mateo continued his daily struggle. But in his heart, something had changed. While he still spoke to his mother, he now also thought of Genesis. He didn't understand why, but her presence had brought him a calm he hadn't felt in a long time. That calm, however, was about to be tested. In the orphanage's hallways, Jamie was planning a new way to torment Mateo, and this time, it was going to be much crueler. Mateo had learned to walk with his head down and his heart hardened. At the orphanage, every day was a silent struggle. The mocking whispers and laughter at his expense were constant, but Mateo had developed a skill to ignore them, or at least to pretend that nothing affected him. Inside, however, the emptiness and pain only grew. Every night, before falling asleep, he spoke quietly to his mother, as if his words could bridge the distance that separated them. "Mom, I feel like I can't do this anymore. I don't know if I'm as strong as you wanted me to be. Everyone here is mean to me. Even the adults don't listen. I miss your hugs. I miss your voice," he whispered, covering his face with the blanket. He felt that on those nights, something was listening. It wasn't an obvious miracle, but sometimes, even in his despair, he experienced an inexplicable calm. It was as if his mother's love still surrounded him somehow. During the day, his torment continued. Jamie, the leader of the older boys, had a special fixation on Mateo. He was the perfect target, quiet, weak, and alone. That morning, as Mateo walked through the yard, Jamie and his group intercepted him. "Where are you going, orphan? Going to cry to your mommy?" "Oh, wait, she's not here, is she?" Jamie said with a cruel smile. Mateo clenched his fists but didn't respond. Jamie, frustrated by his lack of reaction, decided to push further. "I bet it's your fault she died. Don't you think? That if you hadn't been around, she'd still be alive?" Those words were like a dagger. Mateo, who had already wrestled with that guilt in silence, felt his eyes fill with tears. But instead of running, as he had done so many times, he raised his head and faced him. "It wasn't my fault. She loved me, and I loved her. You don't know anything about that." Jamie was taken aback by his response, but his pride wouldn't let him stay silent. "Oh, yeah? Let's see how much you love her. I bet you don't even have anything of hers. You've probably already forgotten her." Jamie shot a knowing look at his friends, who immediately went to Mateo's room. There, they searched until they found the drawing he had made for his mother, the one thing Mateo treasured most. They pulled it from the drawer and brought it to the yard. When Mateo saw what they had in their hands, his heart raced. "Give it back. It's mine. Don't touch it." Jamie, with a malicious grin, began tearing the drawing into pieces in front of him. "No!" Mateo screamed, launching himself at Jamie with all his strength. Though small, the force of his attack took Jamie by surprise, and he fell to the ground. But Jamie's friends quickly intervened, holding Mateo back as he struggled uselessly to break free. "Calm down, orphan. We're just playing," one of the boys said mockingly. At that moment, one of the caregivers appeared, and the older boys scattered quickly, leaving Mateo on the ground with the torn pieces of his drawing. The caregiver looked at him with a mix of irritation and confusion. "What are you doing on the ground? Pick that up and get back to your activities," she said coldly before walking away. Mateo stayed there, gathering the torn pieces of his only tangible memory of his mother. That night, he escaped to the cemetery again. When he reached his mother's grave, his anger and sadness exploded. He threw the pieces of the drawing on the ground and cried uncontrollably. "Mom, I can't do this. I'm not strong. I can't be what you wanted me to be. Please, take me with you. I don't want to be here anymore. I don't want to live without you." He collapsed to his knees, the weight of his pain too much for his small body. Suddenly, he felt that familiar warmth wrap around him. It wasn't a physical touch, but something inside him told him he wasn't alone. "I am always with you, my son. Even if you don't see me, I'm here." Mateo looked up, as if expecting to see his mother standing before him. There was no one, but the words echoed in his mind with a clarity he couldn't ignore. He closed his eyes, feeling as though his mother was speaking to him from somewhere far away. "Mom, I'll try. I don't know how, but I'll do it for you." As he spoke, a figure appeared behind him. It was Genesis, who had felt a strong urge to return to the cemetery that night. When she saw him kneeling before the grave, her heart broke. "Mateo, what are you doing here again?" she asked, approaching him gently. Mateo turned, surprised but not afraid. For some reason, Genesis's presence felt comforting. "I'm talking to my mom. It's all I have left." Genesis knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Your mom is proud of you, you know? All the love you have for her, I'm sure she feels it wherever she is." Mateo stared at her, searching for the truth in her words. "How can you know that?" Genesis sighed, her eyes filling with tears. "Because I've also lost someone I love very much. My son. And even though I can't see him, I know he's with me. I feel him every day, like a whisper in my heart." For the first time, Mateo felt that someone truly understood his pain. In that moment, Genesis made a decision. She knew she couldn't leave this boy like this. Something inside her told her they were connected by a greater purpose. "Mateo, can I help you? I want to get to know you better, to understand how to bring peace to your mom, wherever she is." The boy didn't respond, but a glimmer of hope appeared in his eyes. For the first time, he felt that someone wanted to take care of him. Genesis returned home that night, determined to do something for Mateo. But when she spoke to her husband about getting involved in the boy's life, he reacted with surprise and resistance. "Genesis, you can't save every child you meet. We've barely started recovering from what happened to our son. This isn't about saving everyone," she responded firmly. "This is about this particular boy. There's something about him, something I can't ignore. It's like our son is guiding me to him." Her husband couldn't hide his frustration. "And what if this hurts us even more? If it breaks you more than you're already broken?" Genesis looked him straight in the eye. "I'd rather take the risk than do nothing. That boy needs someone, and I feel like that someone is us." Her words hung in the air, thick with tension. Though her husband didn't respond immediately, he knew she wouldn't back down. Something inside her was driving her to help Mateo, and nothing could stop her. Genesis stared at the soft glow of the lamp in her bedroom as the night dragged on. Her husband lay asleep beside her, but she couldn't close her eyes. The image of Mateo, kneeling at his mother's grave, filled her thoughts. The pain in his eyes reminded her of something far too familiar, something she had tried to bury with the wreckage of her own life. The air in the room felt heavier as Genesis closed her eyes, and the memory of the worst day of her life surfaced like a wound that had never fully healed. It was an ordinary morning. Genesis and her husband, Arturo, were in the kitchen, finishing their preparations for work. Their son, Gabriel, a 10-year-old boy, was distractedly eating breakfast while watching TV at the table. "Gabriel, hurry up or you'll be late for school," Genesis said as she checked her purse. "Yes, Mom," Gabriel replied without looking up from the screen. The doorbell interrupted their routine. Genesis opened the door to find her mother, Gabriel's grandmother, leaning against the doorframe. Her face was pale, and one hand rested on her abdomen. "Mom, are you okay?" Genesis asked, alarmed. "I think I ate something bad. I just need to rest for a bit," the woman replied weakly. Gabriel, hearing the conversation, immediately got up from the table. "Grandma, sit down. I'll make you some chamomile tea. School can wait." Genesis frowned. "Son, you can't miss school. You have an important test today." "Mom, I can't leave Grandma like this. I'll just make her tea, and then I'll go." Arturo intervened, glancing at his watch. "We're going to be late. Gabriel, if necessary, I can call you a taxi later. Just make sure you go to school." Genesis, still worried, ruffled Gabriel's hair before leaving. "I'll see you later, love. Do the right thing and don't take too long." With that, she and Arturo left, trusting that Gabriel would keep his word. But fate had other plans. While Gabriel boiled water on the stove, he helped his grandmother lie down on the living room couch. The old stove had a defect that Genesis and Arturo had noticed weeks earlier, but they never imagined it would pose a deadly risk. The gas accumulated in the pipes found a spark. The explosion shook the house, sending flames and smoke everywhere. Neighbors came running, calling the fire department. Amid the chaos, they managed to pull Gabriel's grandmother out, unconscious but alive. The flames, however, consumed the kitchen before anyone could go back inside. Gabriel, who had been standing right by the stove, died instantly. When Genesis and Arturo arrived, only the charred remains of what had been their home were left. The firefighters confirmed what they didn't want to believe: Gabriel had not survived. The loss of Gabriel shattered Genesis. For months, she blamed herself for leaving the house that morning, for ignoring the signs of danger in the stove, for not insisting that her son go to school. "If I hadn't let him stay, he'd still be here with me," she repeated constantly, like a mantra of grief. Arturo, though equally devastated, tried to stay strong for Genesis. But cracks began to show in their relationship. Days were silent, nights endless. The image of Gabriel, always smiling, haunted them both. Years later, as Genesis tried to rebuild her life, the dreams began. In them, Gabriel appeared just as she remembered him: messy hair, bright eyes, and that smile that lit up any room. The dreams, at first confusing, gradually began to take on meaning. That night, after her encounter with Mateo, Genesis dreamed of Gabriel again. In the dream, he was sitting on a wooden bench in a park. Genesis approached him, her heart racing at the sight of her son. "Gabriel, my love." "I miss you so much," she said, her voice breaking. "I miss you too, Mom. But you have to stop blaming yourself." "What happened wasn't your fault," Gabriel replied, his voice soft but firm. Genesis's tears flowed freely. "If I hadn't left you that day, if I hadn't gone." Gabriel took her hand, as he had when he was little. "You can't keep living in the past. But now, you can do something, Mom. That boy, Mateo, he needs you, and you need him." Genesis looked at him, confused. "Mateo? Why are you saying this?" Gabriel smiled. "Because he's as lost as you are. And because together, you can heal. Adopt him, Mom. It's for both of you." Before Genesis could respond, Gabriel stood up from the bench and began walking toward the light. She tried to follow, but she woke up in her bed, her heart pounding and Gabriel's words echoing in her mind. Genesis sat up in bed, her hands trembling. Arturo stirred awake, sensing her movement. "What's wrong?" he asked groggily. Genesis looked at him intently, her eyes filled with determination. "I had a dream. Gabriel spoke to me. He asked us to adopt Mateo." Arturo sat up, surprised. "What? Genesis, are you sure this isn't just your mind trying to find meaning in all this?" She shook her head. "No. I felt it, Arturo. Just like I did when I dreamed of him after the fire." He said it clearly. "Mateo needs us, and I need him." Arturo sighed, feeling the weight of the conversation. "This isn't something we can decide based on a dream. We're talking about bringing a child into our lives. A child who's broken too." "Exactly, Arturo. He knows what it's like to lose everything. And I think we can help him, and he can help us too." Arturo looked at her silently for several moments. Finally, he nodded slowly. "If you believe this is what we need to do, then we'll try." but we need to be sure we can handle this." Genesis took Arturo's hand, grateful for his support. "I am sure. And I know Gabriel would be too." That night, Genesis made a decision that would change all their lives. She would do whatever it took to adopt Mateo, no matter how much time or effort it required. Gabriel's words had become her new mission. The sky was overcast, as if the universe itself shared the burden Mateo carried in his heart. That night, while everyone at the orphanage slept, Mateo slipped out of his bed carefully, ensuring not to wake anyone. He had waited for this moment all day. In his hands, he carried a bouquet of flowers he had picked from the orphanage's neglected garden and his backpack, where he had carefully stored the patched-up drawing he had made for his mother. He walked through the silent streets, feeling the chill of the night wrapping around him. His bare feet on the pavement reminded him how far he was from the warmth he had once felt at home. After a long walk, he reached the cemetery, the only place where he felt he could truly be himself. Mateo knelt before his mother's grave. He carefully placed the flowers on the headstone, ensuring they looked just right. "Hi, Mom," he said, his throat tight. "I brought you these flowers. They're not the prettiest, but they're the only ones I could find." His small hands touched the cold stone as his voice began to crack. "I miss you so much. Everything is so hard without you. The kids are mean to me, and I feel like nobody cares about me. I know you told me to be strong, but I can't. I just can't anymore. Please, Mom, if you can hear me, take me with you. I don't want to be here anymore." He lay down on the grave, as if doing so could bring him closer to his mother. Closing his eyes, he hugged his backpack tightly, using it as a shield against the world. Minutes passed, and Mateo didn't realize he was being watched. Genesis had felt a strong pull to return to the cemetery that night, as though something was calling her. When she arrived, she saw him, Mateo, curled up on his mother's grave, so small, so fragile. Her heart broke at the sight. She knew the boy's pain was a reflection of her own, a mirror in which she could see herself. She approached him slowly, ensuring not to frighten him. "Mateo," she called softly, kneeling beside him. The boy lifted his head, startled. At first, he wanted to get up and run, but something in Genesis's eyes stopped him. There was warmth in her gaze, a tenderness he hadn't seen since he lost his mother. "What are you doing here?" Mateo asked, wiping his tears with the sleeve of his shirt. "I was looking for you," Genesis replied gently. "I know this is your special place, but you can't be here alone in the middle of the night. It's not safe." Mateo lowered his gaze. "It's the only place I can talk to my mom." Genesis sighed, understanding his need. She placed a hand gently on Mateo's shoulder, as though afraid he might break. "You know, I talked to someone who isn't here anymore too. My son, Gabriel. Do you remember I told you about him? I lost my son years ago, and many nights I come here to talk to him, to ask him to guide me. I think he's the one who brought me to you." Mateo looked at her curiously. "Why?" "Because we're both searching for something, Mateo. You miss a mother's love, and I miss the love of a son. And I think we can help each other." The boy frowned, unsure of what Genesis was saying. She continued, her voice filled with emotion. "Mateo, I want you to come live with me. I want to give you the love you deserve, the love your mom would have given you if she were here. I can't replace her, I would never try to, but I can be someone who cares for you, someone who loves you like a son. Because I think you can give me something I've lost too, the love of a son." Genesis's words hit Mateo like an unexpected wave. He stood slowly, taking a step back. "Why would you want to adopt me? I'm just a kid, and I'm not special." Genesis stood as well, moving toward him calmly. "Don't ever say that again, Mateo. You're special because you carry the purest love inside you. Your mom lives in your heart, in your words, in your promises. And I want to be part of that love, if you'll let me." Mateo stared at the ground, tears filling his eyes. "What if I lose you too? Everyone I love leaves." Genesis felt a lump in her throat, but didn't back away. She knelt to his level and took his hands in hers. "I can't promise I'll never leave, Mateo. No one can promise that. But I can promise that as long as we're together, I'll do everything I can to make you happy. To care for you, to love you. Will you give me that chance?" The silence between them stretched, broken only by the sound of the wind. Mateo, still hesitant, looked at his mother's headstone. He closed his eyes as if searching for an answer within himself. "Mom, is this what you want for me?" he whispered, barely audible. At that moment, a strange feeling washed over him, as if his mother's love enveloped him. He felt he wasn't making this decision alone. Tears streaming down his face, Mateo slowly nodded. "Okay, but you have to promise you'll never forget me, no matter what." Genesis smiled, feeling her heart, broken by years of pain, begin to mend. "Never, Mateo. Never." She hugged him gently, and after a few seconds, he returned the embrace. For the first time in a long while, Mateo felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. When they returned home that night, Genesis told Arturo what had happened at the cemetery. He listened silently, his jaw clenched. "Genesis, this is too fast. We barely know this boy. It's not about time, Arturo. It's about what I feel. When I'm with him, I know I'm doing the right thing. It's like Gabriel guided us to him." Arturo took a deep breath, knowing Genesis wouldn't change her mind. "I hope you're right, because if this doesn't work, we could hurt him even more." Genesis looked at him firmly. "I won't fail him. I won't fail us." In her heart, Genesis knew this was only the beginning of a new journey, one filled with challenges, but also love and redemption. A few days later, Genesis had started the process of adopting Mateo, facing an endless bureaucratic journey. Every document seemed to require another, every signature another form, and each day without Mateo officially at home added more weight to her heart. It wasn't easy for Mateo either. Every time he left the orphanage to spend time with Genesis and Arturo, he felt a mix of happiness and anxiety. Although Genesis had promised to adopt him, the weight made him fear that something might go wrong. Between visits and phone calls, Mateo and Genesis began to strengthen their bond. Genesis told him stories about her son Gabriel, while Mateo shared memories of his mother, Lisbeth. Arturo also started joining these conversations, showing Mateo that he wouldn't just have a mother, but also a father ready to care for him. But a special day was approaching, one that filled Mateo with both excitement and nostalgia: Mother's Day. Mateo knew this day would be difficult for Genesis. He had heard her talk about the serenades her husband and Gabriel used to give her every year before their loss. Since then, she hadn't listened to music on that day, as the pain of their absence weighed heavier than any celebration. Mateo, however, had a plan. The night before Mother's Day, Mateo couldn't sleep. In his small corner at the orphanage, he had kept a bundle of roses he had picked from the garden. Part of them were for his mother's grave, but the rest were for something special. Mateo wanted to bring back the serenades Genesis missed so much, even though he had no money to do it. He moved silently through the orphanage, making sure no one saw him, and climbed out through a first-floor window. With the roses in hand and a heart full of determination, he began walking the city streets, offering the flowers to passers-by. Some looked at him with suspicion, others with pity, but little by little, he started selling them. "A flower for Mother's Day? They're pretty and cheap," he said in a timid but determined voice. A kind-faced man bought several flowers and asked, "Why are you selling roses so late?" You shouldn't be out here alone. Matteo explained his plan in detail. The man nodded with a smile. I hope you achieve what you're trying to do, kid. It's a beautiful gesture. After hours of walking and selling flowers, Matteo had collected a small amount of money, but it wasn't enough to hire musicians for a serenade. Refusing to give up, he searched for street performers, asking how much it would cost to have them play outside Genesis's house. It's 200 pesos, kid. That's our minimum, one of the musicians said. Matteo counted his money and, with sadness, realized he had only half. His eyes began to fill with tears. Please, it's for a lady who's always been kind to me. I want her to have a serenade because she told me that since her son died, she hasn't had one. It's really important to her. The leader of the musicians, an older man with a guitar, crouched down to look Matteo in the eyes. You did all this on your own for her? Matteo nodded. I sold flowers all night. I don't have any more money, but I want her to be happy, even if just for a moment. The man sighed and looked at the other musicians, who nodded in agreement. All right, kid. What you have is enough. We'll give her the best serenade we've ever played. Matteo smiled with relief and gratitude. Thank you. Thank you so much. That morning, Genesis woke up early, as always. Although Mother's Day was usually a painful date, she was determined to spend it with Matteo and Arturo, who planned to visit her later. As she arranged some flowers in a vase, she heard something she hadn't heard in years, the sound of guitars. She walked to the window, confused, and what she saw left her speechless. A group of musicians stood in front of her house, playing a melody that was painfully familiar. It was the same song her husband and Gabriel used to sing to her every Mother's Day. Tears began streaming down her face. She stepped onto the porch and saw Matteo standing next to the musicians, holding a bouquet of roses in his hands. Matteo, what is this? She asked, clutching her chest. The boy approached slowly, unable to hide his shyness. He extended the flowers toward her. Happy Mother's Day, Genesis. I'm not Gabriel, but I want you to know that I love you very much, and I wanted to give you something special, just like he used to. Genesis took the flowers with trembling hands, unable to hold back her tears. She knelt down and hugged Matteo tightly. You have no idea what this means to me, Matteo. This is the best gift anyone has given me in years. The musicians continued playing, filling the air with a melody that seemed to carry the memories of a love that had never truly left. Arturo stepped out of the house, surprised by the scene, but as he understood what was happening, he smiled and embraced Genesis and Matteo. I think our son sent us this little angel, Genesis said as she stroked Matteo's hair. That evening, Genesis called the orphanage to share what had happened, but the director's reaction was unexpected. He ran away again? Ma'am, I understand that you want to adopt him, but this behavior only shows that he's a troubled child. Maybe he's not ready for a home. The director's words infuriated Genesis. He's not troubled. He's a child who has suffered more than he ever should have. If you judge him for his pain, then you're not doing your job. The director sighed. Adopting a child like Matteo won't be easy, ma'am. I hope you're prepared for the challenges ahead. Genesis hung up the phone, more determined than ever to fight for Matteo. That night, as she held the boy who had fallen asleep in her lap, she knew that no matter how long it took or how many obstacles they faced, Matteo was already part of her family. The wait had been long, filled with endless paperwork and sleepless nights of uncertainty. Genesis had fought tooth and nail against bureaucratic obstacles to bring Matteo home for good. Deep down, she knew she wasn't fighting alone. Arturo supported her unconditionally, and every time she saw Matteo's eyes light up with hope during their visits, she felt that Gabriel was also with them, guiding them to this moment. It was a sunny morning when the phone rang. Genesis picked it up with trembling hands, hoping to hear the words she had longed for. The voice on the other end confirmed what she had been waiting for. "Mrs. Genesis, the paperwork is complete. Mateo is officially your son." Tears streamed down her face as she covered her mouth with her hand. Arturo entered the living room and, seeing her expression, didn't need to ask. "Is it official?" he asked, his voice filled with joy and relief. Genesis nodded, unable to speak. Arturo hugged her tightly, sharing her joy. "Let's go get our son," he said with a smile. At the orphanage, Mateo was sitting in a corner of the yard, idly playing with a small twig. He had learned not to expect much from visitors who promised him a home. He had heard stories of other children being adopted and then returned, as if they were broken objects. Even though Genesis always assured him that everything would be fine, doubts lingered in his heart. Suddenly, a caregiver approached him with a smile. "Mateo, come. Someone wants to see you." Mateo dropped the twig and stood up, his heart pounding. He walked slowly to the main room and, opening the door, saw Genesis and Arturo. Genesis was holding a bouquet of roses, the same ones Mateo had sold to give her his serenade. Arturo was holding a balloon that read, "Welcome home." What are you doing here?" Mateo asked, still not understanding. Genesis knelt in front of him and offered him the bouquet. Her eyes were filled with tears of joy. "Mateo, we've come to take you home. You are officially our son." Silence filled the room as Mateo processed what he had just heard. Then, he ran to Genesis, hugging her with all the strength his small body could muster. "Really? I don't have to come back here anymore?" he asked, sobbing. Genesis stroked his hair. "Really, my son. You're part of our family now, forever." Arturo stepped closer, placing a hand on Mateo's shoulder. "You have us now, and we'll do everything to make you happy." Mateo hugged them both, feeling for the first time in a long while that his life was heading towards something full of love and safety. The first day in his new home felt like a dream to Mateo. Genesis and Arturo had prepared a room full of colors, with framed drawings on the walls and a soft bed that seemed made for a prince. "This will be your space, Mateo. You can decorate it however you like," Genesis said as he looked around wide-eyed. Mateo walked through the room, touching every item as if he needed to confirm it was real. Finally, he turned to Genesis. "Can I put the drawing I made of my mom here?" Genesis smiled. "Of course, son. That drawing will always have a special place in this house." Arturo entered with a box in his hands. "And we also have this. We thought you could use it to store important things." It was a wooden box with a small lock. Mateo took it and nodded. "Thank you. I'll keep things about my mom and you in here." Despite her joy, Genesis hadn't forgotten the words of the orphanage director, who had suggested that Mateo was a difficult child. She decided to confront her before leaving. "I want you to know something before I leave with Mateo," Genesis said firmly. The director looked at her, surprised. "This boy, whom you labeled as problematic, has more kindness and strength in his heart than many adults. If you didn't see it, it's because you didn't want to. I hope no other child here is judged the same way." The director, visibly uncomfortable, said nothing. Genesis turned to Mateo and extended her hand. "Let's go home, son." A few weeks later, Genesis, Arturo, and Mateo visited the graves of Gabriel and Lisbeth. Mateo had insisted on bringing flowers for both. Kneeling before his mother's gravestone, Mateo carefully placed the flowers. "Mom, I'm okay now. I have a family, just like you wanted. I'll never forget you, but I want you to know that I'm happy." He turned to Genesis, who stood by Gabriel's grave, silently crying. Mateo walked over to her and took her hand. "Thank you for being my mom now. I hope you're happy too." Genesis hugged him, feeling that her heart, scarred by so many losses, had finally found a purpose. Arturo joined them, placing a hand on Matteo's shoulder. "We're a family, and we always will be." In the months that followed, Matteo's life changed completely. He learned to trust, to laugh without fear, and to love without hesitation. Genesis and Arturo, though they never forgot Gabriel, found in Matteo a new reason to move forward. The past didn't disappear, but it stopped being a burden. Genesis and Matteo shared a unique bond, born from pain but blossomed in love. And so, amidst laughter, flowers, and songs, the happiest chapter of their lives began. What did you think of this story? Tell us in the comments. What would you do in a similar situation? We invite you to like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends or family as a way to show support. This motivates us to keep posting exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next amazing narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We deeply value having you here with us. You can click on the links currently appearing on your screen. We have an exclusive selection of captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video. Big hugs!